Alright, it's time again for another edition of the segment Generations Reflecting on Lifestyles. And tonight we're talking at the conversation between Damon Cassidy and a real estate expert, Freddie Smith, called Baby Boomers Did Not Have It Worse, by the channel called Damon Cassidy. He's a Gen Z uh, guy, and you can check out his YouTube channel called Damon Cassidy. And what's interesting is that the actual conversation is much more nuanced than the title might suggest. That is a little bit provocative, but neither Damon nor Freddie argues that Boomer had easy lives. So let's listen to the initial seconds of the video, and then we'll come back for a reflection about the whole video.
While Gen Z faces an American dream that now costs over $100,000 a year in all 50 states, forced to navigate the most expensive housing market in history, and a dollar worth 86% less than it was for baby boomers, it's easy to forget that during the 1980s, boomers also endured one of the largest reductions in real wages since the Great Depression, a housing market that saw prices increase by over 85%, factories closing as millions of jobs were outsourced overseas, all while the nation remained consumed by the Cold War and the aftermath of Vietnam. Well, in order to understand the root of the nation's growing generational divide, I spoke with Freddie Smith, a real estate agent and associate broker who has built a career exposing the data behind America's generational inequality and the rising cost of living, where he broke down which generation has actually had it worse and why we continue to ignore the real culprits behind this economic collapse.
The boomer advice is typically to, you need to save your money, stop with the coffee, stop with all the stuff, quit buying TVs and phones because you need to save, because the luxuries in the 1980s were actually really expensive. So they were living in general, a more humble life, because we do have the luxuries of being able to have multiple TVs for a couple $100s, where back then they had, their rent, however, was probably around $200 to $250, which was very cheap. But if they wanted to buy 3 TVs like most families have today, they're $1,000 a piece back in the 80s. So it'd be $3,000. A CD player was $500, a cell phone was $2,000, a computer was $2,500, a microwave was $500. So all those luxuries that we just all take for granted now would have cost them $8,500 to buy that, which would be equivalent to 3.5 times their rent, 3.5 years their rent. So yeah, and $8,500 is also equivalent to a 20% down payment on a $40,000 home. So if you think about like the boomers thinking of this, going, if you have 3 TVs, a cell phone, a computer, a microwave, this is why you can't buy a house, because we couldn't have any of that. That was our 20% down payment for our house, or that was 3.5 years of our rent on those luxuries. Where today, 3 TVs, music and Netflix is 3 TVs is $600. Music, Netflix, and subs say $100. A cell phone's $1,000. A computer can be $500. Microwave $200. Is $2,400. And our rent is typically around $2,000. So it's essentially all those luxuries that were equivalent to a 20% down payment for them equals about 1 month of our rent. So our rent is our luxury now, and the final button on it. For the average house, you would need probably around $60,000 for a down payment. So the $2,400, if you just didn't have any TVs, no subs, no cell phone, no computer, no microwave, you would still be 60 grand short of a 20% down payment. So I think that's what's changed. But back in the 80s, even though the luxuries were expensive, things like education, healthcare, cars, gas, like everything was cheaper. The necessities were cheaper.
One of the other things that I think about too is the perception of people in the 1980s. So you were raised during a period of time where your dollar was worth something. There was peace and prosperity for the most part. and so quickly that went away. There's a statistic where the dollar lost about 53.7% of its value between 1970 and 1980. That's 10% more than we've experienced the last 2 decades. And so we've seen that since the loss of labor unions, wages just aren't even remotely close. Pensions started to get degraded during that period of time. Minimum wage was not raised once during Ronald Reagan's era. And because so many jobs were outsourced during that period of time too, the jobs that came, the 16.1 million jobs that came during Reagan's 2 terms, were predominantly in service-related industries. And we can see we are now a service economy. We don't have that manufacturing base that we once had.
All right, that is an introduction of the theme. You can watch the full video in his YouTube channel called Damon Cassidy, and look for the video called Baby Boomers Did Not Have It Worse. And so, as I was saying as a kind of disclaimer, Damon Cassidy here is not saying that boomers had easy lives, as the introduction show. In fact, both of them begin by acknowledging something many younger people sometimes overlook, that the late 70s and early 80s were not easy years because inflation was high, interest rates were high, factories were closing, entire industries were changing, and many families were under enormous financial pressure. So right from the beginning, the discussion is not that boomers had it easy and young people had it hard. So that's the discussion is actually much more interesting than that. The real question they ask is, if we compare the overall economic conditions faced by different generations, which generation ended up carrying the heaviest burden? And that's a much better question. So one of the first things Freddie addresses in an argument is an argument that most of us have heard before. And if young people stop buying coffee, stop buying smartphones, canceled Netflix, stopped spending money on luxuries, they would be able to afford a home. That is what many boomers still say. And Freddie pushes back against this idea, not because people shouldn't manage money responsibly, of course they should, but because the numbers don't really support that explanation. In the 1980s, many things that we now consider ordinary were actually expensive luxury items, as he mentioned in the video, such as personal computers, microwaves, electronics, early mobile phones. These weren't cheap, but here's the important difference. Housing remained accessible to a much larger percentage of working people. So even after buying some expensive consumer products, many families could still realistically expect to purchase a home. Today the situation often looks very different. You can eliminate every streaming subscription you own, every coffee, every smartphone upgrade, and still find yourself tens of thousands of dollars away from a down payment. And that changes the entire conversation. Technology became cheaper, necessities became more expensive. Now, throughout the discussion, housing repeatedly emerges as the central issue. And honestly, it's difficult to overstate how important housing is, because housing affects almost every other part of life. When people can afford stable housing, they are more likely to save money, to start families, to plan long term, to build wealth, and feel secure. When housing becomes difficult, everything else becomes more difficult too. And that's one of the major themes Damon and Freddy keep returning to. Not that previous generations got free houses, not that nobody struggled, but that housing consumed a smaller percentage of income for a larger percentage of people. And that's a major distinction. Then the discussion moves toward wealth, and this may be the most important part of the entire conversation. Because one thing the speakers point out is that the United States became dramatically wealthier over the last several decades. The country generated enormous amounts of wealth. The economy grew, markets grew, corporate profit grew. But then comes the obvious question, who received that wealth? And this is where the discussion shifts away from generations entirely, because Damon and Freddy argue that a large proportion of that growth accumulated at the top, meaning that the country became wealthier without the average person necessarily feeling proportionally wealthier. And this is where the conversation stops being boomers versus millennials and starts becoming top versus bottom. And one section I particularly appreciated was the discussion about Generation X, because Generation X often seems to disappear from these debates. Boomers get discussed, millennials get discussed, Gen Z gets discussed nowadays, and Gen X somehow gets skipped. But Freddy makes a compelling case that Gen X experienced a remarkably difficult sequence of economic disruptions too. They entered adulthood around the dot-com bubble. Many were hit by the 2008 financial crisis, like millennials after university, and many experienced wage stagnation, the decline of pensions, and corporate restructuring, and also the rise of unstable employment that's been holding on for the last 15 years. And many Gen Xers are now simultaneously supporting children and aging parents, which creates a unique form of pressure. So the video is not saying millennials invented hardships. It's reminding people that every generation faced real challenges. Now let's talk about millennials, because millennials entered adulthood during one of the worst economic moments in modern history, the 2008 financial crisis. Many graduated into weak job markets, many delayed buying homes, many delayed marriage, many delayed having children, and while technology was advancing rapidly, many traditional milestones of adulthood became harder to reach. Not impossible, but way harder. And when it comes to Gen Z, this may be where the conversation becomes more sobering, because Gen Z enters adulthood in a world where many of the trends discussed throughout the video have already intensified, with higher housing cost, higher education cost, higher healthcare cost, and higher living cost. And perhaps most importantly, a growing perception that the traditional pathway into adulthood is becoming increasingly difficult. Now, here's where I like to add a little bit of my own reflection, because I don't think the lesson is that one generation had everything, and I don't think the lesson is that another generation had nothing. Life doesn't work that way exactly. Every generation inherited advantages, and every generation inherited disadvantages. Boomers often benefited from more affordable housing, but they dealt with inflation, economic shocks, and Cold War uncertainty. Generation X often enjoyed greater independence and lower housing costs than today, but they faced repeated economic disruptions and major financial crises. Millennials gained extraordinary access to technology and information, but entered adulthood during a major economic collapse. Gen Z possesses more information and opportunity than any previous generation, but also faces some of the highest barriers to housing and financial stability. So perhaps the most useful question is not who had it hardest, right? Perhaps the better question is if we add together all the major categories of life, what does the overall balance looks like? I mean, the overall balance sheet look like, including housing, education, healthcare, cost of living, career stability, family formation, saving money, building wealth. When we compare those categories individually, different generations win and lose in different areas. But when we total them together, the picture becomes clearer. Because while younger generations enjoy extraordinary advantages in technology, communication, and access to information, many of the fundamental building blocks of adult life became significantly harder to access. And that's where I think Damon Cassidy's discussion ultimately leads, not toward blaming boomers or attacking millennials or turning generation against one another, but toward a more honest observation that every generation faced real struggles, and every generation paid the price somewhere. But if we make a net calculation, if we total all the major advantages and disadvantages together, I think it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that millennials and especially Gen Z appear to be carrying the heavier cumulative burden. Not because they are weaker, not because previous generations had easy lives, but because more barriers now exist simultaneously. Higher housing costs, higher education costs, higher healthcare costs, greater difficulty accumulating wealth, greater difficulty reaching traditional milestones. And when several of those challenges arrive at the same time, the burden compounds. So perhaps the lesson is not that one generation deserves blame, or perhaps the lesson is that every generation should want the next one to have a better starting point, right? Because at the end of the day, most people are trying to achieve the same things: a stable home, meaningful work, strong relationships, financial security, and a future that feels attainable. And if those goals are becoming harder to reach for larger numbers of people, then that's a conversation worth having. And that's what made this discussion from Damon Cassidy and Freddie Smith so interesting. Not because it tells us who to blame, but because it asks us to look honestly at the conditions people are facing today. Alright everyone, that's been tonight's segment, Generations Reflecting on Lifestyle. And after a brief recess, we're coming back with our editorial in the final stage of this live stream.